Welcome to TP201, Transfer Pricing for Tangibles. We're going to continue with the resale price method, and I want to talk this time about an issue of a resale price method where the data you have to use is external. So an external resale price method as opposed to being able to use internal data that the client has made transactions with both related and unrelated party suppliers and then sold everything to unrelated purchasers and is able to look at those two margins. Now we're going to say, what if your tested party buys everything from a related party but then sells to an unrelated party, and the only reference point as a benchmark for this is we're going to be able to get as an external firm. So how would this work exactly? Well, let's start from this slide that we used before when we started to talk about the internal RPM, internal resale price method. And the key thing here that I just want to point out is that we were looking at the P&L of UKCO, which is our distributor, and they're making a gross profit of 30 on sales of 100, so they have a gross margin of 30%. Pretty easy mathematics. Now, let's talk about what an external RPM would be like. In this case, suppose we go out and we search our databases and we find a comparable uncontrolled distributor. That uncontrolled distributor has sales of 200, it's got a cost of goods sold of 142, and therefore it earns a gross profit of 58. Operating expenses of 50 and an operating profit of 8. Well, now if we look at that party, we can't directly compare their gross profits because they've got much different bases, but we can look at their gross margins. Let's just bring up a pointer so we can talk about here and say, if we look at this gross profit right here, and we're taking it relative to the sales level of 200, well, we can do the math, work that out. That's a gross margin of 29%. And as we talked about before, our related party has a gross margin of 30%. Let's bring up this next slide. So what we've got is a very close comparison. In other words, if we were to say, take that 29% here, which is from this uncontrolled transaction, and apply it here, this would suggest that the COGS would need to be 71. We'd have a 29% gross margin. Well, this is very, very close. If we were to go out and find, say, a whole set of comparable uncontrolled distributors, and they were all fluctuating around this point of, say, 29, 30, 31, 32%, we'd have very strong evidence that says our UK firm, by earning a 30% gross margin, would be in the range, and therefore its transfer price would be defensible. Now, all that said, this is very sensitive to the similarity or the comparability of the uncontrolled distributor and our tested party, which in this case is UKCO, right, our distributor that we're looking at. Let's talk about some of the things that are going to matter here. And this is what we've called the external RPM. So I will say that professionally, a lot of individuals who do transfer pricing analyses feel that it is very hard to reach the comparability standard necessary to feel confident in doing an external RPM. But there would be times when even an external RPM, even with some degrees of differences in comparability, might be a more reliable method than a comparable profits method. And we've talked about sometimes comparing the RPM to the CPM and situations in which the RPM would be more reliable. So let's go on and talk about that a bit. Well, what are some of the drawbacks of this method, or what are some of the things that we need to worry about? I'm going to actually drop to the bottom item first because I think it's the most straightforward to talk about. Just like some other methods like the cost plus, which we'll talk about soon, and others, it's going to be very sensitive to the classification of COGS versus operating expense. If two firms classify what is considered COGS versus what is considered operating expense differently, then that's going to shift costs from one level of the income statement to another level. If the COGS were understated because the expenses were listed as operating expenses, then that would, the COGS are down, so that makes the gross margin bigger, but it picks up in the operating expense, and therefore those two things eliminate by the time you get to the operating margin. And that's one of the reasons some people feel more comfortable doing their analysis at the operating margin level, because this problem of misclassification of COGS for operating expense wouldn't affect an operating margin or any other measure of profitability using the operating profitability as the numerator. Now, that said, quite frankly, in discussions with individuals who are CPAs in our practice, there's a high degree of certainty that people really do, when they sign off on an audited financial statement, have and do apply a reasonably close definition of what is COGS versus what is operating expense. Especially when we're thinking about distributors. They said the issues here are pretty straightforward. One could dig into the notes in the financial statement to sort of reconcile differences that might exist and probably create a more reliable number if need be. But in general, the numbers should be reasonably good. So let's set that one aside. I'm just going to bring up my eraser and get rid of this circle then and talk about some of these other items. Some of the issues that are going to be very important are going to be, are the two distributors both functionally similar and do they bear similar risks? So let's talk about some of the risks issues, etc. It's often the case with a distributor that you want to find out through asking questions of your tested party who's bearing which risks. So for example, what currency are they dealing in, and do they bear any foreign exchange risk? And does that same risk affect your comparable uncontrolled transaction? Now, this is not just the risk of, say, for example, I'm operating in dollars, I'm a U.S. distributor, but I'm buying my product in my parent local country's currency, which might be euro, and therefore, if I have to pay back in euros, I'd be facing some dollar-euro exchange rate risk. This is also an issue of saying, I'm buying from a foreign supplier, and if if exchange rates move in the economies in general, what are the implications of that? Not just in, say, repaying a payable that's on my books and records in a month or two from now where exchange rates have moved, but just what's going on in general with exchange rates, what will happen to the cost of the product I'm buying if I'm buying from my foreign parties, whether it's dollar denominated or euro denominated. If the exchange rates are moving and the price of that materials from that supplier are moving up relative to maybe my comparable is a U.S. distributor who's buying from a U.S. supplier, and there's not going to be much of an impact of an exchange rate movement on their transactions at all. Knowing that difference could be very important in saying, do I think that I've isolated the risks of, say, exchange rate movements and that they're comparable across the two parties. Some of the other issues might be things like what happens in the event that merchandise is unsold. Do I have a right to return it to my supplier? Does the supplier turn around to me and say, I will offer you a substantial discount, so you mark the property down, sell it off, but I'm going to give you some type of rebate or discount the payable you have to me for that merchandise because we've got a long-term working relationship. Now that might happen more frequently amongst related parties than it might among unrelated parties, and that would be important to know. There can also be important differences along the lines of, say, the amount of support that might be provided for, say, advertising programs. Often a supplier will give a distributor a program payment where it says, if you undertake X amount of advertising, I will reimburse this percentage of it up to some amount. Is that the same between two firms? And where is that being recorded in the cost of goods sold and relative to the expense? Because the advertising expense will be a below the line item. So if someone says, you undertake advertising and I sell to you at a discounted price because of that, now we're going to be affecting how we're measuring the gross profitability. And someone might say, well, that's an argument for doing your analysis from the operating profitability line. Again, there's always going to be a trade-off, and so one has to look at whether one can observe that, make it comparable between the two parties, and if not, can you then turn around and at least adjust for it somehow from notes in the financial statements. So these are some of the things to worry about. Exchange risk, who bears credit risk if someone doesn't pay a bill, who's got the inventory risk or the stock risk, what happens if prices start to change in the marketplace. All these things can be important in trying to defend that the external resale price method that the comparables are sufficiently comparable to have a reliable analysis. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video and the others in our series about the resale price method, and have a great day.